If you've ever tried a traditional language learning method, then you know they look something like this. You buy the textbooks, you take the classes, you practice speaking a bit in the mirror, and then eventually you'll move to the country where you can become fluent and everything is perfect. So if you've ever spent any time researching AJATT or an immersion method, then you know that they have very, very different approaches when it comes to speaking and output. So in this video, I'm going to talk about that exactly. Real quick, I just launched a Patreon and private Discord community, so if you find my content helpful, then please consider supporting. As you probably already know, the basic AJATT philosophy is just input and not output. So learn through comprehensible input, use the SRS like Anki, and speaking, it doesn't really matter. But the controversial thing here is that many AJATTers and immersion learners will say something like, well, if you just input enough, you'll eventually be able to think in your target language, which is going to lead you to outputting. And while this does work for some people, there's a lot of cases where someone can be inputting constantly for like 4-5 years and then never have that little magical moment of just being able to spontaneously speak Japanese. Now, if we look at the typical experience of a foreigner moving to Japan the traditional way, they might pick up a few phrases, understand some Japanese, maybe even get a Japanese girlfriend. But these are often the people who mostly stick to, like media from their home country and will hang out with the other expats there. And really, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's very different from the guy who goes to Japan and dives fully in the AJATT, most of the time without even realizing it. Even though most people in Japan don't really speak English, at least conversationally, especially outside of Tokyo. Like I was in Fukuoka and I didn't meet a single person who could really hold a conversation. You can still get by without learning much Japanese. Like I met many foreigners on the street there who had been there for months and even sometimes years, and they still could not speak Japanese. So immersion is definitely not automatic, even if you live in Japan, and it's definitely possible to completely avoid it. The whole narrative of moving to a country will make you fluent is not always exactly true. This reminds me of talking to my friend from Italy who speaks fluent English without ever having lived in an English-speaking country or even being to one. And when I told him about how I learned Japanese through AJATT, he was like, yeah, I basically do that with English. Like he started watching English YouTube when he was a kid because he thought the content was more interesting, and even though he couldn't understand much at first, he just kept watching it because he liked the videos, and without realizing it, he basically followed an immersion method and ended up fluent. Now what about AJATT and speaking? So consciously memorizing a ton of grammar rules and vocab isn't really going to help you output because there's a gap between your conscious and your subconscious knowledge. So what I'm trying to say is grammar rules aren't really going to help you output necessarily, but they'll help you acquire input, so they're still useful. When you go to output, you don't want that delay from your conscious knowledge trying to solve the language like it's some kind of math problem. It's too slow and it's going to kill the vibe of your conversation. So that's mainly why immersion exists, so that you can build that subconscious model of the language and then speak without actually having to think. So that's all great, but what about the actual output? Is it true that it comes naturally? Generally, if you want to start outputting, the best thing I can tell you to do is just start with typing. So in the beginning, you want to be going very slow. If you're really unsure how to say something, then that's kind of how you know that you're not ready to output yet. It's better to just kind of hold off on it. Outputting is more of like a skill of saying what you know versus saying what you want to say. And I know that's a little contradictory, but this is why, for example, in the first few days I was in Japan, people literally told me that I sounded like an anime character, and I knew what I was saying was anime Japanese, but I literally said to my friend as a joke, like, "Yoshi, ikoze," and he was just laughing like so hard because, it's funny, like it's anime Japanese, but it's still like, it makes sense, it has a meaning. So should you practice output? If you want to, go for it, but for an immersion method, it's really not necessary. I was outputting a lot when I was in Japan, and I know that most AJATTers usually build up that subconscious knowledge over the first year or two of AJATT, and then they go to a little output phase for a month or two in Japan. Also, the thing here is don't wait until you can say exactly everything you want to say, because realistically, it's probably just not going to happen. Like, I might not be able to talk about philosophy in English or politics in English to someone in Japanese, right? That's usually why these people immersing for like 4 years, 5 years, and I still can't speak. It's not that they can't output, it's just that they can't reliably say everything they want to say, which in turn makes them think that they cannot output. So of course there can be a variety of factors to this, but that's certainly possible. And if you do decide to output, just start with typing and then stick to what you're confident in saying. But honestly, you can never really go wrong by focusing on input and surrounding yourself with native content. So in the end, it's really going to take everyone a different amount of time to when you can actually, output fluently. So in conclusion, should you practice output? You can if you want, but at least if you're doing an immersion method, there's not much benefit. Early outputting is not going to kill you, but it might be damaging to your long-term goals if you really care about speaking native like Japanese. If you want to output, definitely start with typing and try to say what you know that you can already say. But generally, you can never go wrong with input and immersing in native content. I hope this video had some value for you. If you liked it, amazing. If you didn't, that's alright too. So with all that said, それじゃまたね.